our last presentation really, I think, is in an effort as we put this together to bring closure to everything you've heard today. We've talked about the hazards, we've talked about response issues and how we will respond. That's very scary. But I think what we haven't spent enough time on, not just at this forum, but in general with our planning, because it's a very tough question. It's a very tough issue to get our arms around, and that's the recovery. How are we going to recover? There's not an agency out there that's defined as the recovery agency. It's not FEMA. It's a combination of agencies that have that function, whether it's HUD for housing, it's the economic development folks. There's a whole bunch of them out there, and this is really starting to be driven home more and more by the bigger disasters like Katrina and now Sandy, that we have to do a better job of figuring out what the recovery looks like. I was very surprised and pleasantly surprised by Dr. Berryman's point about the recovery essentially that was taking place after the earthquakes there in New Zealand, that they've actually done better than what they had projected following the event. Now, I think that's because the communities were proactive. They had things in place to help the community to move forward, the sheltering in place and helping the businesses and some of the unique things to deal with the businesses. We're not thinking along those lines in our planning, and that's what we need to be doing. So, again, it was vitally important that our friends from New Zealand could be here and share those lessons. And we're going to hear a little bit more about the recovery issues with David Johnston, who was just on the panel. And again, hopefully some takeaways there as we can begin to look more closely at what's necessary to build the recovery plans we need. So, David?
Thank you very much. What I want to do in this time is really just give a touch on some of the key issues we faced in New Zealand, if I can get the pointer working. Very good. And just go over some of the experiences we had on a number of aspects. The recovery and anyone involved in recovery is very complex, and many of the issues we could talk about for days, so I won't do that. Some of the initial slides were put in here because I wasn't able to fully see what Kelvin had, and it'll just really remind us on where we were. Hang on a second, sorry, pushed the wrong button. Where we were, where New Zealand is and some of the issues, so I will sort of move over through these. So as we had heard earlier, this earthquake struck an area in New Zealand, and what was very interesting to me in the work that I'd done in New Zealand was around people's perceptions of risk and what we were planning for. So New Zealand, we had a long history of understanding the earthquake risks. We had a major earthquake in 1931, which in fact was our last large urban disaster in the city of Napier. But New Zealand had really had 80 years of relative benign time where we hadn't had any major urban earthquakes of the scale that we were to see. But much of the populace were thinking of the next earthquake in some of the higher seismic hazard zones. And one of the take-home messages that we have learned as a country is that the next event doesn't necessarily be in the most likely areas. So high impact events do occur in low seismic hazard zones. And it's really sort of the reason why we've been doing work with the US is really to understand that the next event could be in a community near you. So this was Christchurch before the event, but for many of the citizens, this was, the chances of an earthquake were low. They did not see themselves as the community that was going to be impacted. But the emergency management officials, many of the utility companies, were planning and had done extensive work around earthquake preparedness. And many of these preparedness measures paid off at the time. So after the first earthquake in September, there was major damage to infrastructure, but most of it was with unreinforced masonry buildings. There was liquefaction, there was disruption to utilities. I'll just skip through. And that's the sequence which you saw from Kelvin. And that was the event in September. So we had this period of time between September and this is the event in February. And the reason why this cartoon actually sums up very clearly to me why it was so bad. If you were to design an optimum fault system to do the biggest harm to Christchurch, I'm not sure you could have designed a better system. It was really directed straight at the city. And the chances of this were very low, but the impact of such an event was quite catastrophic, as we saw. So really, this was, in some ways, there were 4 major magnitude 6+ earthquakes, but it's often portrayed as the tale of 2 earthquakes. It was the first 2 that were significant. So the 7.1 event, 30 kilometres away, what was interesting for me was the 0 fatalities. There were many injuries, but there were only 2 serious injuries. And there was much discussion about we had done well. What didn't do well, as has been described, was the unreinforced masonry buildings. We know that they do not perform well anywhere, and that was highlighted in this event. But many of the buildings that which were hit by this were damaged severely and closed off, and were not available to be impacted by the next event. But the event in the February event was the catastrophic one, as we've seen. So some of this is repeating what Kelvin said. And this was the CTV building, which was the site of 115 of 185 fatalities. This building was not, as the Royal Commission showed, up to code. It should not have actually been built the way it was. It shouldn't have been approved. And the catastrophic failure of it led to the significant loss of life. But what was very interesting in the CBD, or disturbing, was the impact on business themselves. The entire central business district was closed off afterwards, and these, just to illustrate the point, are the offices of the Community and Public Health Department. So there were only a couple of minor injuries in this building. Everyone walked out. But instantly after the earthquake, the resources that the community would rely on, in this case public health officials, were displaced from their offices. All their computers, all their records, everything was taken from them instantly when they left the building, and they were unable to return for about 8 to 10 weeks afterwards, before they were given about half an hour in there to retrieve stuff before the building was demolished. So one of the lessons for business continuity came out of this was information, and the tools that we have for our everyday people were disconnected from. This event occurred at lunchtime, and I've heard literally hundreds of stories of people who had popped out to get some lunch, were walking. Their cell phones, their car keys, their handbags, their briefcases, their wallets were in their offices at the time, and many of them never were able to retrieve them. So it's we suddenly had people not having some of the essentials. So just imagine if you didn't have your smartphone with you, your car keys, and you could never get them again. So there were many little things that people learned rather quickly. What we see to this day is many Cantabrians always carry those items with them. Now, for a population, and we can't underestimate, and this was another thing the public had told us, they knew about earthquakes, but they did not anticipate the effect that aftershock sequences had. The ground shook constantly for months and months afterwards, and it had mixed effect. A lot of people learned to get by with it, but for a lot of people, it was a massive source of stress and distress to them. So this long duration aftershock sequence that just went on and on, you could not get away with it. It was one of the factors that drove a lot of people to leave. Their houses were habitable, they could be there, but just putting up with aftershocks for months and months afterwards, in this case for over a year, was enough to cause people just to have enough. And some people left not straight away, but after the second or the third of the magnitude 6 events, because there was another sequence of aftershocks. So one of the criticisms we've had of our public education is we hadn't adequately prepared people for the consequences of earthquakes in terms of understanding the aftershock sequence that will continue and what it does to people. This model here really shows the modeled aftershock sequence, and what we had initially afterwards, the rate of aftershocks were below what we would have predicted. So once again, between that September and February part, people were not really expecting what was to come, and it was a rude awakening for many. This map here was illustrating just shows where the liquefaction was. And once again, this earthquake event did impact the city differentially. The people who lived out on the west side were much less impacted, both physically and to their properties, but also psychologically to some of the people who were in the east that were suffered both from the hill suburbs and the liquefaction. So even in a relatively small geographic area, the population can be quite differently affected, and that shapes how people respond and interact. There are those who have and those that don't. The people out in the west had electricity and water and sewage much quicker than a large chunk of the population. So if you look at your populations, you'll find there are more vulnerable areas than others, and that will affect how the response and the recovery manifests and the impacts and the distribution of it. Sorry about that logo, but this really shows that the consequence and the point that Kelvin made about the liquefaction damage. So many houses that were built to code where ground shaking wasn't the key impact, it was really the differential, the land response that caused the significant impacts to them. Now this event had a massive international response. New Zealand is a small country, 4 million people, and the initial response exceeded our resources. So there was global effort. We had 7 rescue teams from the US as well as Australia, the UK, Japan, China and Singapore that came within the first 2 to 3 days after to assist the New Zealand. So we internationalized this event, and we were very grateful for the assistance that we got, both from engineers, from the military and medical people from many countries. So this was in some ways our first international disaster. We for many years had sent assistance to other countries, but we were in this time the recipients of it. There was a massive resource need because we had large portion of the populations, over 100,000 people, who ceased to have functioning water and sewage systems. So one thing we know from the experience in New Zealand, but you can anticipate here, the damage that liquefaction does to the underground services. And you may have large areas, and with continuing aftershocks, the ability to repair the systems. There was much repair work done between September and February that was then just damaged again by the next event. So supporting communities in that aftermath. And we in the east, because it has now taken the sewage system is only coming back on stream in certain suburbs 3 years after the event. Many of the citizens have lived for over 3 years with portaloos or chemical toilets. So once again, life changed for many. But out to the west of the city, many of these services were returned within a few weeks. So once again, this differential impact on certain groups within a small geographic area, depending on the vulnerability of the land that their houses were built on. So there were impacts for everyone, but it wasn't evenly distributed, and that does cause impacts on the community as a whole in the recovery period. In the short term, we had welfare, but it was interesting, of the 180,000 damaged properties, there were less than a few thousand people only for less than a week in welfare centres. Most people who did leave their houses found somewhere to go with friends and relatives or paid for accommodation or left the region. So there wasn't a massive overload of welfare in the welfare centres, and it was actually less than many had anticipated would be needed. But out east, water, the provision of water was a major problem and was a sustained problem for a long time. So there were many tens of thousands of people who had many weeks, more than 3 or 4, with no toilets, no running water or no electricity. And the community adopted many ways to deal with this, and there was provision. But it does make life hard, and it's the provision of these services that does need to be coordinated and understood, and the impacts of it. So many people talk about leaving the area to go and see friends, and one of the 2 things that people seem to do when they visited from these areas was to charge up their cell phones and have a shower. Those were the 2 most common reasons people cited from the areas without these services for leaving them to go and see friends or family who were on the other side of the town that had. What we saw in the Canterbury earthquakes was this massive spontaneous volunteerism, which we see in many disasters globally, but it manifested in New Zealand in a new way because we are in the age of social media. Much of the information provision to the citizens who were disconnected from telecommunications, the cell phone networks down, telephones were down, power was out, was through various social interactions. But once the cell phone networks were running again, social media played a very new way because it was, and an important way in connecting people. We saw groups, emergent groups form, such as now famous Student Army, where a student had to set up a site on Facebook and mobilized several thousand students from the other side of the city who spent many weeks volunteering to move the liquefaction. A vast amount of the liquefaction material was shoveled by volunteers. The famous farming army, the farmers of the area, came in to the city with their tractors and assisted some of these community efforts in cleaning up this liquefaction. And there are many informal groups that have developed after the earthquake that are still functioning today to meet some of the social needs that developed. But within 6 weeks of the event, this was the 1st of May, many things, here is just some of the summary. So there, at the end of the event, there were 185 confirmed fatalities, of which 115 were one building. But our Accident Compensation Corporation that covers injury losses, it's a government insurance scheme, there were 2,500 injuries, and this includes even the most minor ones, but that's of the total injuries, 2,500 from the September event, and 7,500 of them from the event in February 2011. But power was restored within 6 weeks, water was restored except for the CBD area that was closed off. About 97% of people had functioning toilets, but for many of them out east, literally thousands of them, it was these portable toilets that they used. Schools were closed for 6 weeks, and that was something I'll talk about, migration, because many thousands of students relocated, school students relocated to other schools in New Zealand. Our school system is run from a country, because we're only the size of a state, and all schools were required by the Ministry of Education to accept children from Christchurch after the event. And all the schools were closed for 6 weeks at the beginning of term. So well over 50% of all New Zealand schools received one or more child, and about 7,500 children were dispersed throughout the country. Many of them, most of them in the Canterbury region, but many further afield. And that sort of in some ways spread the impact of the earthquake much wider than the physical location throughout the country, because I had an 11-year-old son, and in his class he had 2 pupils from Christchurch for a whole term. So many of the schools in New Zealand were experiencing the event. So much of the other, and in the end, at the end of this, there were 26,000 houses vacant that were not able to be inhabited of the city of 180,000 properties. So there were a lot of people out. And with the multiple earthquake events, the Earthquake Commission, that's the national insurer, had received well over 340,000 earthquake claims. Just some of the statistics. So where's it going? Okay. Stopped. I've stopped for some reason. Oh, there it is. Okay. So some of the work that I've been looking at is, because we have a national health insurance scheme, all injuries from the earthquake were recorded using a consistent form, and we were able to get access to the database of all 9,500 injuries. And what I was particularly, and it relates to the shakeout exercise today, was looking at how people were injured in both events. And in summary, what we see is in the September event, we were able to separate between people who were injured by the earthquake itself directly, as in they were hit by something, an immediate injury caused by something hitting them, to an action injury where people were injured during an action afterwards. And what we see is that actually in the September event at night, the majority of the injuries were not caused by directly something, object hurting someone. But in February event, it was the other ratio. And really that comes in terms of public safety messages, and one of the lessons we've learned is that if we are to prevent earthquake injuries, so this isn't the deaths that occurred, this is just the injuries, the 9,000 injuries, that the building codes and the securing of fittings are important. But what we do see too is that a large number of people were injured during the actions they performed during or after the earthquake. Were not actually directly related to the earthquake injuring them. So there's still more work to be done to understand people's behaviour during earthquakes that came out of that. So one of the key issues also following the event and concerns was the impact of the ruptured sewage system throughout the eastern suburbs. Christchurch gets its water from an artesian system. It's very pure water from deep wells. But we had ruptures of much of the sewage system in the eastern suburbs and the fear of contamination. So what we've seen in many disasters globally is outbreak of infectious diseases because of this environment. And the Ministry of Health were very concerned, and many steps were put in place. What we didn't have was an outbreak. There was some transgression, some monitoring of the water supply, but they instituted a number of measures to protect the health and safety, and what we saw was there was no gastric outbreaks in the city. The public health officials were able to prevent that. But what transpired or what occurred was that the public health people had been dealing with the H1N1 global pandemic, and they were able to roll out their pandemic response plan in a new context that they hadn't planned on, but actually worked highly effectively in preventing any disease outbreak. And I think this is another example where emergency planning for other contexts can be moved over into this event. So the public health officials in Christchurch willingly admit they hadn't really done much planning for an earthquake, but they were able to use their pandemic response plan in a new context. And it was quite appropriate around hand washing, boiling of water and other measures that were, and the mechanisms to transmit that information to the community. So I think public health is a critical part to play in any recovery. One of the concerns also with 13,000 properties losing their primary heating, so chimneys, open fires, chimneys falling down, damaged them, was to make sure we had adequate heating for the winter. In Christchurch, it frequently freezes overnight in the winter period, and there was a massive project to allow many of the very damaged houses to still be occupied and to look after the well-being of the people in them. And it was of concern that although we had survived the earthquake and they were in it, that during the winter that there could be disease outbreak because of people living in cold environments because of the damage. There was a major effort really in the public health to make sure that the winters were survivable for people who were living in houses while their repairs were still being undertaken. And the repair has taken a long time. So the last area I'll touch on briefly is around the social and psychosocial impacts. And once again, there was the physical damage is obvious, but there was much concern, as we have in many disasters, about what could occur to the public in terms of providing support for the community. But the literature or the understanding globally about psychosocial support is really quite clear. What we know is that we get very few people at the top end who need professional services. Most people, however distressed they are, however stressed they are, can be supported by the community itself. So basic services and security and information and community and family support are really the critical part of providing a post-disaster strategy for supporting the community. And only a few people really do need specialised services. So much effort was put in place to support the community during the recovery. As the repairs of the damaged properties has taken a long time. They still have not repaired all the damaged properties 3 years on, and it may take another few more years to finish it completely. But there's been much effort to look after the well-being of the public. So some of the key strategies are really providing connectiveness. What we've found in the post-earthquake environment is that people did come together, as they do in disasters, and this happened in Christchurch, but continuing to find opportunities to keep people connected in the recovery phase, and also getting people to understand that the reactions that they feel are normal, normalizing some of the experiences they have had. And PTSD is a medical term for post-traumatic stress disorder. Once again, the rates in Christchurch are much below than many of people predicted. And it's about consistent messaging and also really about evidence-based services. What we found is that there are a lot of people who came into Christchurch, well-intentioned, often NGOs, providing what were at sometimes inappropriate services. People wanting to be helpful, but sometimes not in a way that was helpful. So that needs to sort of be looked after. This diagram is probably a little unclear, and I'll move through it, but really just shows the relocation of the population. So one of the big fears is that we would get a massive outflow of people in the post-disaster environment, like had seen in any other disasters. But actually the population in Christchurch is only slightly down and will probably increase after the event. We saw the immediate flight of about 20% of the population in the first 2 weeks after the earthquake. But that was sort of understandable, and we saw this is the number of school children who left. Many of the school children, about 7,000 left, also left with caregivers. So many families separated after the event, where one member of the household stayed behind, dealt with the damage to the property, and children were usually disproportionately women, but children and caregivers often went to friends and families outside the area. So you will see a thinning out of your population, but that thinning out in the short term was no predictor of long-term population loss. That was actually just people getting away during that aftershock sequence, and most returned. And Kelvin talked about the retirement of the land as a long-term way to mitigate the most damaged environment. And there's been a compensation scheme for those properties, but that's had a few issues too. Just on the rockfall, that's just some images of the liquefaction. And this is the properties were both from liquefaction and rockfall damaged. This is an interesting photo. I think Kelvin showed this house on the other side, but that boulder there, once upon a time was up there, and on its journey down the hill went through that house. Once again, that image was already shown. So one of the challenges we had, and this is attempting to do it, was to frame up risk in New Zealand. So much of the debate about life safety, about building safety, is around risk criteria. And this diagram was put together to really see how various risks from various hazards in New Zealand shape up as a way to help sort of make decisions. So we had so the acceptable levels. So in terms of framing risk decision making for the life safety from rockfall hazard, much of the conversation tried to be around sort of framing it up in terms of other risks, which is quite complicated. And this led to the land use decisions for which properties should be allowed to be occupied under these cliffs or not. So there was some basis on it. So really just the last slide is one of the questions we have is about how well are we doing in recovery. And internationally there has been much literature about recovery, and in New Zealand we at the early days of developing the recovery strategy were keen to learn as much as we could. But what we're seeing now is almost a global interest in using or understanding the recovery process in Christchurch and in Canterbury to understand what are the factors. So the Earthquake Recovery Authority, SERA, has undertaken a number of projects ready to do this. And I'll just mention two of them that I think are quite significant and are available to you and provide a guide. So the Canterbury Wellbeing Index was developed to bring together brought 28 government departments together to integrate a whole lot of data about recovery. And these are things such as crime rates, youth achievements in schools, health responses. There are about 28 different indices that come together to create a wellbeing index to map the recovery. And this data is done every 6 months and gives us a benchmark. Now the selected criteria for this index were taken from our global knowledge about what are key predictors of recovery. So I think there is use ahead of time, and we hadn't done this in New Zealand, to identify what are some of the predictors of the recovery and to use that knowledge to shape some of your planning for what you need to do to assist the recovery. But also I think it's important to put measures in place because there's a social cultural context that differs in every disaster, and you need to make sure that what is important in one community is the same or not in another. Now the other piece of work we've done is to randomly select 2,500 citizens every 6 months to ask them about how they are doing, to have a feedback loop with the community to see how well they're doing. And that's the SERA Wellbeing Survey. And that's now done 3 cycles and will continue it for at least the next 2.5 years, if not longer, to really understand and to feed that back into the recovery policy. What we've also seen in New Zealand, and this will be available, is a massive influx of researchers globally looking at it. So we in the social area know of at least 300 separate research projects in Christchurch looking at aspects of the recovery. And one of our projects, Sarah Bevan, who is in this group, and many other who are in our group from New Zealand are part of, is to, in various points in time starting next year, is to synthesize much of the research findings from these many independent studies into an overall understanding of the key factors that shape recovery and feed that back to other communities who may be planning to or are responding to events. So I think there's a great opportunity to share much of the experience from Canterbury to assist in your thinking about what you need to do before the event. But also we would welcome knowledge and expertise from others to come back and discuss that with us in New Zealand. So I'll leave it at that.